Well, hello there. I figured I'd be lazy this morning and give you an answer to your question about Africa in a way that wouldn't require me to type you out a book. Okay, it's pretty simple. Um, During the period of colonization through the 1718 and early 1900s, Europe and England colonized Africa, and while they were there, they subjugated the people and raped the area of its resources, took the resources home, and kept the money from the sale of those resources within those Western nations. Now, after that, and after World War II, it was decided that holding colonies was no longer something that was moral. So, unlike the other nations who were required to break up their empires and give freedom to those who were formerly oppressed and colonized, England came up with this really brilliant idea that while they were colonizers, they built infrastructure in these countries. And in order to attain freedom, these countries were required to purchase their countries back from England to pay for the infrastructure that England had built in their nations. So countries like Kenya were literally given a tab. They were told, you can now be free, you can now have your own governments and rights, your own laws, but in exchange for your quote-unquote freedom, you now owe us billions of dollars for basically to purchase your own nation back from us. So because of that, these nations went into extreme amounts of debt to the Western nations who had once colonized them. So what ends up happening is when debts come due, these poor nations who do not have a right to their own resources, because the Western nations continue to be there and use those resources, export those resources back to their home countries, and keep the money for those resources within those Western nations, every time a bill comes due, African nations have to basically sublet or sell off the rights to other resources in their nation in order to pay these debts, quote unquote, to these nations who had colonized them previously. So countries like Kenya, where my wife was born and is originally from, they have elections. People get elected based on, we're going to get rid of the debt, we're going to get rid of the corruption, and we're going to fix the economy. And then they get into power, and they look around themselves, and they realize that the only way to get out of debt and fix the economy is to have the right to their own natural resources, which have all been sold off or have all been given as collateral to the World Bank in order to pay off the debt for the right to be able to have their own nation that was their own nation to start with. So this is basically where we are. You have African politicians who begin with good intentions. When they get in office, they realize that there literally is nothing that can be done. So they take the aid money that is sent by foreign nations and put it in their own pockets, because they know that the aid money doesn't really matter. It's basically welfare so that Western corporations can continue to rape local lands and local resources, and they create permanent welfare states for Western taxpayers to support. So De Beers and Pat Robertson and all the big diamond companies, and you have massive famine in Kenya and Somalia, while most of the organic fruits and vegetables that are sold in parts of Western Europe and England come from Kenya and Somalia, while the GMO products that are grown in Europe are then imported into Africa. It's a big scam, basically, where you and I and taxpayers in Western nations are forced to prop up welfare states all across Africa and Asia in order for the businesses in our countries to be able to go there and rape the resources, and they keep the money. So basically, the big corporations and the governments make lots and lots of money, and all the people on all sides get screwed royally. You and I and taxpayers in Western nations are screwed because we're forced to fit the bill to pay the welfare states in these countries to keep the people from starving to death. And the people there are screwed because they're left in a position that they have no choice but to receive foreign aid in order to subsist themselves, because they no longer hold the right to make profits off the natural resources within their own boundaries. So this is where the problem is in Africa. Africa is a very rich continent as far as resources are concerned. The problem is that Africa has no rights to those resources. England has rights to those resources. The U.S. has rights to those resources. Germany has rights to those resources. The Dutch have rights to those resources. It seems like the only people who don't have rights to the resources in Africa are the Africans themselves. And until the resources of Africa belong to the African people will continue to struggle and will continue to move backwards. All the money made off of diamonds, imagine if all the money made off of diamonds in the last 4 decades went to fund Africa, not to fund Pat Robertson, or to fund Israeli settlements, or to fund American or English companies. If all that money had been kept in Africa and African economies to employ African workers and African owners and African citizens so that they could create their own welfare state if they wanted one, because they had the funding to do so. But they can't, because the resources in the ground in their countries somehow belong to us.